Welcome back to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough. I am Angie Grant, your host, and I am so excited to welcome you. Welcome a special guest today. Her name is Ashley Rodriguez, and actually met Ashley through email, but I'm so excited to share or have her share her story with you. So, Ashley, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So, I like to just jump right in and get to the good that you are bringing here today. So, Ashley, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story and what led you to where you are today.
Sure. So, growing up, my mom was a correctional counselor. She did substance abuse groups at Rikers, which is a jail. And so, in my neighborhood, there were a lot of substance programs, and a lot of her clients, when they were discharged, would continue their work in that area. And I remember running into several of her clients, being so excited to tell her about their journey and how much of a difference her work made. And so from young, I saw that and I wanted to do something similar. My hope was to help people before they get to that point in their lives. So I decided to focus on children and I did child psychology. And then working with children, specifically in foster care, I saw actually, if I want to make the biggest difference, I need to work with the parents. And so I then specialize in perinatal mental health, and that's what I'm doing in private practice, focusing on supporting families through pregnancy and postpartum.
Oh, that's so cool, and it's so close to my heart too, Ashley.
Mm.
I I am a speech language pathologist. I started in the autism field working with kids directly, and I too saw that in order for us to have a bigger impact on our community, we have to help our parents heal their stories so that they can show up for their kids, right? Like it's great being a clinician working with kids, but to have a much bigger ripple effect, I 100% agree with you. It's the parents that I'm called to help too.
Absolutely. And what I noticed in working with the parents is that by giving that holding space and helping them to understand how their childhood impacted how they're showing up now as a parent, just by having them feel understood, I already saw in their parenting them reflecting the same to their child. And so that sort of what we call nested mentalization model of I hold the mother in mind, mom holds the baby in mind, and then I'm held in mind as a clinician by my supervisors and other colleagues. I saw it in action, working specifically in foster care. Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I also was a foster parent for a couple of years too. And so
Okay.
seeing that dynamic about how important it is for the whole community to wrap around these kids
Mm.
is just so profound. Um, I would love to hear a little bit more about maybe hmm, I'm trying to think of where I want my question to know next. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experiences and maybe some personal things or personal experiences that you had that really helped you step into who you are.
Mm. Okay. I will say in training, I had this idea of I wanted to follow my mom's legacy in some ways. And then I had an assignment to do a genogram, which is a fancy way of saying a family tree.
Hmm.
And you just track, different patterns and different things in your family. And that's when I realized, okay, my fascination with complex trauma comes from my own family's lineage and experiences. My family came from Puerto Rico to New York under really tough circumstances. My grandfather passed away, and my grandmother was a widow. Her sister was here. And so she moves the kids here to be closer to support. And my family experienced a lot of violence, substance abuse, lots and lots of trauma. And at the time, I didn't understand that was sort of the unconscious driver for wanting to do this work. But when I think about why I'm so interested in like lineage work and specifically maternal lineage work, it's really because a lot of the moms, a lot of the women in my family were forced to take care of others and weren't held or taken care of themselves. And there's a part of me that wishes there was more support for them, but they didn't have access to the same resources that others do.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So interesting. And, I'm hearing more and more about how much of our trauma is carried on our DNA, that
Mhm.
many of us have experienced our own personal trauma that influences our biology. It influences the way our brain has mapped itself, but also we carry that trauma in our DNA and the way that our genes express themselves through what has been passed down to us as well. And when I think about that, I think about the work that you're doing to help break those cycles of trauma and really flip them upside down on their head, right? To help making changes at the DNA level of us. I'm curious what you've come across about that or what your thoughts are about all of that.
Yeah, I think now we're paying more attention to it, which is great because I think it's been not included in the understanding of trauma for a long time, specifically in psychology. There's such a focus on the individual and not so much on systems. And so my interest in intergenerational trauma is also thinking on the systemic level, how these cycles have been perpetuated. And for people of color specifically, and a lot of the families I work with are of color, there's so much that goes unspoken and is unexplained, but is felt. It's felt in
Mhm.
the body and it's true in the body. And so I find it fascinating and interesting to learn more about schools of theory like liberation psychology, where we're really thinking about how these horrendous things that have happened to our ancestors, how they're still impacting us today, how they're still alive in the family system today.
Yeah. Yeah, and such an important topic to be thinking about and talking about too. Not something that's ever really come up on my podcast before, but it's something that I think about so much. Like I'll hear people talking about like, why can't this group move on, right? Like we've moved past that as a humanity. And I think like, well, maybe you think you have, but it is so deep in our DNA. And there's so many subtle things continuing to happen at a societal level that are perpetuating that trauma, keeping that as like the normal state of being. And so, yes, the work you're doing to help us shift the way that we think about each other, about the way we're built, about the way we interact is so important.
I think it's empowering to know, okay, all of these things that have happened to my ancestors, let's think about also the strengths that they had. How did they get through all of those really horrible things? Those strategies are the things that have been passed down. And right now, they just may not be as adaptive. That reframe to me is very different than, this group of people just haven't figured it out or
Yeah.
whatever the sort of messaging is that unfortunately I think right now, especially with the president we have, there's a lot of messaging that's been normalized, I guess, or a lot of hatred that has sort of been normalized right now without thinking about the historical piece and the systemic piece. And with systemic oppression, the idea is that everyone in the system can be not racist and still groups will be impacted unfairly depending on their identities.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you're yes. Man, I'm so glad I invited you to join me to chat today. This is such an interesting topic. And I think, I thought about this a lot too when I was a foster parent, right? I'm a white woman and um there there's the at least in the community where I live, the children who were in out of home placements demographically didn't match the foster parents, right? And it was so common. And even my own son, he's a mixed race and he doesn't look like he matches our family. But I didn't know what to do about that or how to understand what not just his mind, right? Like I knew he came to us with, he had been through some yuck, but I have such a deeper understanding now about exactly what you're talking about, and that deeper genetic, systemic, generational impact that continues to be carried on. It's yeah, and I know many of the listeners are or have been foster parents, adoptive parents, or know somebody who has, who it's hard to know exactly what to do or what to say.
Oh yeah. And I remember when I was doing dyadic therapy, typically with the biological parent and the child. And in both cases that I worked really closely with, the children were likely to be adopted, but the system is complicated, so there's like we're still trying to see if reunification can be a possibility, but it looks like it likely wasn't. Um, and then including the foster parent in that work too, and thinking about this child that's living between two families in some way, and is, in my cases, they wanted to stay connected to their bio parents, and their foster parents are the ones taking care of them. And
Yeah.
so then there's this, push and pull of, who am I? Who's my mom? Uh, this mom is talking bad about that mom, and what does that mean? And what does that say about me? And so I had a lot of sympathy for both parties involved. And I think the system has a lot of work to do in really thinking about everyone that's involved, because in my experience, at least in New York with child welfare, it's very much typically the social worker may already be sort of on one side, like sort of already pushing for adoption or really pushing for reunification. And there's this other party that's always just like on the sidelines, but that's super involved, and that this child also feels connected to or also is connected to. So it's so complicated, and foster parents are so important and need their own, kind of support. And the bio parents, are also really going through it in,
Yeah.
in in that moment. And so trying to think about everyone's feelings and experiences, and then thinking about the child that's in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, that topic is so near and dear to my heart too. Professionally in my day-to-day job, I have many interactions with the child protective system and families who are in, on either end, right? Bio parents, foster parents, potentially adoptive parents, like the whole mix of all of them. And and then me as the outsider in those circumstances, and being there to support the parents and support the child, it you're right, it can be such a messy system. And it's hard in any of those individual roles. It's hard to stay neutral and stay focused on the child. It's really hard. It's hard to not be clouded by our own conditioning and our own lens that we see the world through. Um,
Mhm.
there was something that you were talking about earlier that I was thinking about. I think about this a lot, but I'm so curious your thoughts about, when we think about parenting, and you had kind of mentioned this about your family. Um, and I find parents fit into kind of two camps. I know there are many more flavors than that, but I find that some parents are working so hard to fight against how they were parented. And, like, I'm not going to be like my mom, or I won't do what my dad did, or, they're like fighting so hard against it. Um, and then on the flip side, I find some parents that are very much like they want to emulate what their parents did. I'm curious what your experiences are with that in the populations that you've worked with.
Typically, I work with the first. So I don't want to repeat this cycle, and I don't know what the alternative is. I don't know what that means. And in a lot of ways, that's my favorite family to work with, because they are rewriting what the norm is for their family. And it's challenging when something hasn't been modeled for you.
Hmm.
But that sort of understanding of what happened to me doesn't need to continue, and I'm trying to figure out what this new norm or what this new family culture will be for me. And then a lot of times, because I work with both parents, if both parents are involved, they may have differences in opinion, or their parents might still be involved. And how do I set boundaries with my in-laws or with my mom who has feelings about how I'm doing this differently? That's my typical, and in a lot of ways, ideal client, because it's just so rich to really figure out then what we want to do for this family unit.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, and I find too, similar to your experiences, that I find many of the parents that I'm working with are really fighting against the way that they were parented, whether they were parented like overly strict or overly lenient and almost like lackadaisical, right? And I find it's almost like this um like the pendulum swings so far, right? I was parented so strictly, so I'm going to be super lenient and I won't be strict with my kids. And then the next generation, no, 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 my parents were too lenient. I need to have more structure and routine, that I
Mhm.
find that almost like it's still a pattern, right? Fighting against how we were parented can still become a pattern in that like almost skipping generations.
Yes. And so a lot of my work is focused also on what are your parenting values? What is your parenting compass? And how do we think about what this child needs in front of you? Because it's one thing to say, I don't want to do the same thing that my parents did. And it's another thing to say that, and I need to also meet this child where they're at. Because when we think about children, they're all different, their temperaments are different. And so sometimes what works for one child doesn't work for the other child. And that's usually every once in a while, that's when families come to me. But the first child, this works for them. And I don't know what to do with the second child that maybe is a little more rambunctious or whatever it is. And but I don't want to repeat. So then what do I do? So it's challenging. There has to also be a grounding, and then what is this relationship and dynamic with this child, and how do we adapt things to this child in particular?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and that's so cool. I didn't even ask you before we started recording today, but have you looked into human design at all, or have you studied human design?
I am just learning about it now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no test, I promise. But that exactly to your point that is why I have dove in. When I first learned about human design, I was like, oh, this is interesting, like understanding myself a little bit better. And I wasn't really sure if it was legit or, it seems very woo-woo. But the more that I dig in, the more congruences with who I have always known that I was, but that throughout my life, from, well-meaning family members and not so well-meaning family members, and comparing ourselves to what's outside of us, I had become somebody who was misaligned with who I was. And I didn't know it at the time, but I felt it in, like, physical pain and increased anxiety, like all these symptoms were happening to me. And I truly believe it was because I was becoming so misaligned with who I am, who my soul is. And so really me understanding that, and then realizing, like, oh my gosh, had I known this about my kids when they were little, had I known this about my son when I adopted him, had I known what his energetic needs were and what mine were, I could have parented him so differently. With my daughter, the first one, right? It seemed easier. Biologically, we're connected, but it seemed easier to parent her for lots of reasons, right? I only had one kid. She was my first. I was younger and more energetic. I don't know.
Mm.
Um, but with my son, it was so incredibly hard. And it was easy at the time to blame it on his trauma, his behaviors, his past experiences. And okay, maybe that's part of the equation of our relationship, but a much, much, much bigger part of the equation. Like I think of it like, if we do like 10 times 10, it equals 100 plus one, right? Like I think the plus one was what his trauma that he brought to our relationship. But I think the 10 times 10 was my energy and his energy. 100% of our dynamics, I think, were me not understanding my needs and his needs at such a deep level. And so, yeah, I have dove into using human design with my clients. I try to share it with the world. It's become the main core of my podcast because I feel so passionate about we must know our kids in order to really meet them where they're at and to help them feel seen and help them feel um, like they matter and like we're not trying to parent them uh, in a way that meets our needs, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. And I think of it, it's not completely the same, but I think of it as the concept of goodness of fit.
Hmm.
And so, in thinking about the different dimensions of temperament, and thinking about where the parent is and where the child is, depending on how similar or how different they are, it's going to be a little more work to meet that child's where they're at. Doesn't mean that it's impossible, doesn't mean your relationship is doomed, but just that it takes more intentionality and more effort to really connect with your child.
Yeah. 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 And you had said it's the same but not, but I think it is totally the same, right? Because even like me learning about my kids' design or some of my clients learning about their designs. Like I worked with one family where everybody in the family, mom, dad, bio kid and adopted kid all had the same type. And they were like, "What? I can't even wrap my head around." They were all the same type, which is so unusual where like I am one type and both my kids are a different type. They're similar to each other, but totally different from me. And, that goodness of fit idea of like me, I only know how to be me. I only know how to see the world through my lens, through my experiences, through the way I was parented. I have some broadened perspective as I continue to learn more, but seeing my kids for who they really are, it takes a lot of intention. It takes a lot of a different effort to really see them for who they are and not try to squish them into the box that I know.
Right, right. And that, in a lot of ways is, I think, natural because that's your worldview. And with parenting, I joke that in a lot of ways, children tend to show parents what they need help with or what they need to work on. And so in a lot of ways, they challenge you and they push you in ways that it's not natural or it's not normal.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of my work is normalizing that and validating that. And then also, how can we be curious about what's going on for this kiddo in front of you? What do you imagine this kid is thinking or feeling? And how can we, and by me being curious about the parent, I see that then they also naturally become a little more curious about the child.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
Mm.
That's so interesting. Oh man. So I'm uh yeah, I'm curious like what I'm trying to think of what I want my next question to be. You have so much depth in what you do with families. So
Thank
my
you.
mind is like, oh, I could ask her this, I could ask her that. But I guess I would love to hear more about, yeah, like what led you to my podcast and what do like what is that story or that shift that you really want to share today?
I think really it's that there's just so much shame for parents and there's so much blame on, if something bad happens to the child, it's blamed on the parent. And so I was really looking for spaces where you're having open and honest conversations about how hard parenting is in a way that's not punitive or in a way that's not judgmental. And so a lot of my work is based on, well, I would say I'm integrative, but I'm very much shaped by dialectical behavioral therapy. And one of the tenets of dialectical behavioral therapy is that we all have work to do, right? Like we all have challenges and we can accept that and we need to do better. And for me, it's the holding both sides for parents. Like, yes, you can improve and you're doing as well as you can in this moment, I think helps take away a little bit of that shame because society in general is just so harsh on parents and tends to not really think about what is going on or what's coming up for the parent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And yeah, this is definitely that space for you, as far as like I lay it out there. Like I
Yeah.
thought I was I went into parenting my son feeling so confident. Like eh, I, I would think like to be a foster parent, you should have the skill set that I have. I had a ridiculous amount of training and experience with challenging behaviors, and I dove deep into understanding trauma and attachment. And I feel like I totally failed him. I didn't know how to be for him. I didn't know how to, um, like I was so focused on the behaviors and trying to fix him that I didn't know how to connect with him. And if if his therapists were trying to tell me how, my brain wasn't processing it because I was so right, the behaviors were right in my face. And so you're right, like my parenting journey was full of shame and guilt and resent and regret. It was ugly for a long time, and it showed in what was happening in our home. The police were here on a almost weekly basis. There were countless hospitalizations. CPS was involved. Had to like I had to put my work on hold because CPS was involved in my home and I work with kids, right? It was ugly. And it took me really going in and healing me to fix our relationship. He didn't need to change at all. He didn't need to do anything different, but the words coming out of my mouth at the time were, I of course I'm anxious or frustrated or angry because his behaviors are so atrocious. Well, no, that's not true at all, right? I was anxious and frustrated and angry because of the expectations I had of his behaviors. I expected if I just love him enough, why can't he just like accept my love? Why can't he just behave just a little bit at home? But that's not how that
Mhm.
works. It took me healing and letting go my expectations of how kids are supposed to be, how other humans are supposed to be.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the foster parents that I saw had some kind of connection to foster care themselves, or some kind of background in child development. And then they have a hard time sometimes, relating to the child. And I would think about, this person is providing a home for this child and wants to connect with this child. And that connection is not coming as natural or as easily as they hoped for, and how painful that is. And it makes me think of, we have a concept called ghosts in the nursery, which is when childhood trauma comes up in the postpartum period for parents. All of those like unresolved childhood experiences come up. But I've also seen it with foster parents, like that all of that stuff just gets triggered and gets stirred up. And I think as a system, we need to support, again, everyone involved, like pulling back and zoning out a little bit more, really understanding that behaviors are a communication. And a lot of times in psychology and child psychology, we're focusing on fixing behaviors or stopping behaviors or extinguishing behaviors. And sometimes there's that missing piece of, but what does this behavior mean? What is going on for this child? What is this child trying to communicate to us that they want or need? And I think we do it maybe out of discomfort as a society with feelings and with behavior. There's a tendency to want to fix instead of to understand. Um, but I've just noticed that even in the training for foster parents before like their home is approved, a lot of that training is behavioral and is focused on behaviors and reinforcement. And, instead of thinking about how trauma may show up and how this child having a hard time communicating how they're feeling may show up through their behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reflecting on right like I'm a speech therapist. I know communication or behaviors are communication, right? That is in my blood.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think many of the listeners will relate to this, that I what I found especially hard was that the that idea of behaviors are communication, right? Like cognitively I knew that, but I also I remember thinking, right, I was not in tune with my body, my intuition. And I'm a highly intelligent human being who has lots of training and resources. And when my son was misbehaving, my gut would give me this quiet little, like, just give him a hug. But my mind was like, oh, no, 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 you're going to reinforce the behavior. You were told to do this, this, or this. Like, oh, what would his therapist say if, like all these things were running through my head. And my gut was like, he just needs a hug. He just needs a hug. Right. But I wasn't listening to it. I was letting all of the conditioning in my head happen, is one thing that was running through my mind as you were talking. And the other thing was that this is such a common experience, I think, in that foster care adoption realm as our kids get older, is that the words coming out of my son's mouth were, I hate you. I don't want to be here. You're not my mom. And so I think when you apply that logic of behaviors are communication, I was like, yep, he sure was communicating to me. But as a parent, to reflect on that, like I knew he was hurt. I knew that. I knew he was struggling with connection. And my mind was like, yeah, and he's communicating to me he doesn't want to be here. It's very clear he doesn't want to be here, right? And so that mismatch in our logical mind with our intuitive self is so incredibly hard. And there's nothing in foster care training, at least where I went, that was like, just listen to your gut. Your gut knows what your son needs. None of it said that. It was, here are the steps to take. Here's how you manage behaviors. Here's how to create a sticker chart. Here's how to reinforce, like all those
Mhm.
things, which isn't at all what he needed. And what many of our kids, I would say most, if not all of our kids in care need, they don't need more freaking sticker charts. They need more connection.
Absolutely. I think of behaviors as, in a lot of ways, to communicate needs for connection. And I don't like the idea of like attention seeking behavior. I really think of it as connection seeking behavior.
Mm,
And I think children have such limited ways sometimes to express all that's going on for them. I focused in early childhood in my most recent job, and they have even less ways of saying what they want and need. And so they really show in their body and yeah, in their behaviors. So it's up to us to really like be attuned and what is coming up for us and what do we imagine is coming up for this little kid that is having all these big feelings and maybe doesn't have all the words to express to us what they are experiencing.
yeah. And for us to be able to hear their words and to realize that there's probably a much deeper message underneath the words that are physically
Right.
coming out of their mouth.
Right. And to be okay with what the message is, because
Mhm.
sometimes the message might be painful for us.
Yeah.
And so we need to be aware of, okay, now I'm getting triggered, or I feel rejected, or I feel whatever the feeling is. And my kid is telling me they want or need something opposite of maybe what I want to give or what I feel comfortable giving or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. And I think too, like, I think about, obviously I can't know other foster parents' experiences, but I know some parents in general, foster parents, adoptive parents, biological parents, go into their parenting experience because they want somebody to love them back. That many parents go into that relationship seeking some kind of return. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but then when you're in this position of having this child who isn't capable of returning it in the moment for a multitude of reasons, that I know can be so incredibly hard for some parents as well. And that idea of like healing ourselves, healing our own generational trauma to the best that we can before going into our parenting experience so that we're a little bit less triggered when our kids are doing what they're doing so we can be present for them because you know I genuinely feel like I became a foster parent because I knew that I had love to give. I knew that I don't feel like I was seeking, I need somebody to love me. Like I don't feel like that was part of my story, but who knows? It could have been something deep that I wasn't aware of. But then being in those moments where behaviors were so challenging, it became harder and harder to not be triggered by the words, by the behaviors. And it became harder and harder for me to be present, to do that reflection like you talked about, for us to really pause and be curious about what our kids are trying to communicate to us. It gets hard when we're triggered.
Absolutely. And I think society also reinforces that this is a relationship that is pure. This is a relationship that this child will unconditionally love you. And that's not always the case, or it's just not as clean or as simple as we sometimes make it seem. And children are their own person, their own being. In infant mental health and early childhood mental health, a lot of the work is on thinking about like even this baby has their own mental health. They have their own wants and needs and feelings. And so often a child is easy to project onto in some ways, but they are their own person, separate and outside of their parent.
Yeah. Yeah. I to your point, I'll see the billboards for like become a foster parent, and
Mhm.
I get it, right? Like there's a huge need for more foster parents, and you can't have a billboard that says this is going to be really, really, really hard. Are you
Right.
ready? Right? Like they won't draw on the parents, but I feel like the marketing appeals to those parents who are craving like, ah, I want a child to look at me like that. Oh, I want to, skip through the park with my, teenage foster child, right? Like I think that's what it appeals to, is that desire that we all have as humans to want to be loved, to want to connect. And it's a bit of a bait and switch, I feel like.
Absolutely. And I see both sides of we need more people to step up to be foster parents because there are children that need homes,
Mm,
and we need to support everyone involved. And I think sometimes when we paint too rosy of a picture, we don't prepare people for all that goes into it. And sometimes that causes even more harm for
yeah,
children that, I've worked with children that unfortunately they've been through so many homes
yeah,
because their foster parents, decided that they can't keep this child. And so I see both sides of you want to promote and
Mhm.
you want to recruit and you want to set the situation up for everyone involved to hopefully be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. When, that's my hope with like the work that you're doing. I the work that I'm trying to do, man, it's hard to get out of our own way, but
Mhm.
but to help create systems where where people have the tools and access to the resources that they need to heal themselves, so that whatever type of parent you are, foster parent, adoptive parent, bio parent, grandparent, whatever type of parenting role that you're in, that I am just on a mission. It sounds like you are too, to make sure that parents have the tools that they need to heal, to be present for themselves, be present for their kids, and to look at their kids through a more curious lens than perhaps a like such a fixed lens of this is how kids are supposed to behave, or this is how I was parented, or how I'm not parenting. That curiosity, that flexibility, I think is what society as a whole needs now more than ever.
Absolutely. And I think the parents that are looking for the kind of support that we provide, in a lot of ways, those are the parents that I feel so hopeful about and so optimistic about because they do have that awareness and they just need some co regulation, some strategies, some holding space to figure it out.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Before we kind of wrap up here today, Ashley, is there anything else that you want to make sure that you share with our listeners today?
I would say one thing I was trying to say earlier on, I was struggling to communicate or articulate, is the idea that we're all doing the best we can and we need to do better. And I really think, as parents in particular, parents really need to hold on to you're doing the best you can. And by doing this work, you will do better. I think a lot of my work focuses on also just thinking about what are all the things that have influenced you to this point. And so I love doing things like family trees, really getting a sense of where some of these patterns came from and being curious about them instead of being judgmental. That helps a lot of my clients sort of understand, okay, maybe this is why mom was this way or grandma was this way. So that kind of work is really helpful. And then I would say, whatever the work is for them, it could be journaling, it could be meditation, or whatever it may be, working on also being comfortable with themselves.
Mm.
I see a lot of parents are able to be more reflective and curious when they do that kind of work, when they're able to be comfortable with themselves.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting tip too, or just a interesting perspective of looking at how to support parents is that idea of being more comfortable with ourselves. Yeah, so interesting. I'm just reflecting personally on how it's been such a long journey for myself to become more comfortable with myself. I don't know if I necessarily knew exactly what that was. I remember saying, to people closest to me about a year ago, like I just need to step back because I don't know who I am. I need to figure out who I am, and I would get this feedback, but you like this or you like that. I'm like, I don't know if I like that or if I've just been taught that that's what I like. I need to know myself. I need to understand myself better. So, what a great tip for parents.
Yeah, I've seen the more awareness and the more comfort people have, the less projecting onto their child. The more you know yourself, the less you need, hopefully, your child to be a certain way or to play a certain role.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Um, I know I told you I want you to share a practical tip. I feel like that was a super practical tip. Was there anything else that you wanted to share with listeners?
I think community is so important. So especially for those cycle breakers that are parenting, looking for spaces where they can be open and honest about what's coming up for them. And a lot of times that isn't their family. So that may be groups, that may be looking for role models. And with role models, I will also say really quickly, be mindful to not idealize that person too much, that we all make mistakes, but looking for mentors and looking for community, I think is so important because in parenting, you need a village. And a lot of times the families I'm working with don't have that because they have questioned so much from their family.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, it's lovely. And I agree, like getting yourself out of communities that aren't serving your soul and getting into communities, whatever that looks like, where you really can connect with who you are, I think is beautiful. Yeah, perfect. So where can listeners find you, Ashley?
Sure. So for those of you that are in New York and may be interested in therapy with me, you can find me on my website, ashleyrodriguezphd.com. And for those that are interested in any coaching, consulting, or digital resources through PathBreak, can find me on my Instagram, PathBreak Coaching and Consulting.
Lovely. This was so great having you. It Yeah, you just popped in my inbox and I was like, well, she sounds fascinating. I have to meet her. So you definitely are. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode today. It was such a pleasure getting to know you, and I trust that the listeners will gain so much from this episode. So thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank you.